Saturday, September 23rd, 3:17 p.m. Somewhere nearby, a woman was screaming. Eddie became aware that he was laying on his stomach in a place that was dark, cold, and rough to the touch. Where? His face was pushed into a damp corner, and a woman was screaming like a banshee. He pulled himself up on shaking arms and grimly fought the urge to vomit. Sweet Jesus, his head. He'd smashed it off something, and hard. What? Where was he? Why wasn't he in bed? Who the fuck was screaming, for Christ's sakes? In a sickening rush, Eddie abruptly remembered where he was and why he was there. The Hewitts, their son, and what he had done to them. The minivan. He had whammed his head off of their minivan. Twice. The van in question was currently parked above him. He was in the pit, and blood was trickling merrily down the side of his face from an enormous gash in his scalp. His ankle ached, and there was a sharp, nasty throb in his little finger as well. It was swollen like a sausage, and looked a little bit like a lowercase r. God damn, I'm a mess. Paulson tried to heave himself up to a standing crouch, and... oh, holy Jesus! His ankle. Sweet mother of mercy, his motherfucking ankle. Eddie fell onto his ass and scrambled frantically to unlace his work boot, kneeing like a wounded animal as he struggled to get the knot undone. He kept his broken pinky finger sticking out and away from the action, as if he were trying to lend some Victorian tea time class to the proceedings. The light was dim, and his fingers were clumsy in the face of the agony that roared beneath them. A number of long, agonizing seconds ticked by before the boot was finally undone. Eddie was soaked through with sweat. He clenched his teeth, tensed his body against what was to come, and yanked off the boot. God damn! He howled, and Debbie Hewitt answered him with an anguished howl of her own. Eddie barely even heard her. He was too busy fighting to remove the woolen sock on his left foot. It felt at least 100 times too small. A Ken doll sock that had been magically stretched onto his foot by a malicious wizard. He bared his teeth against the pain and pulled off the sock with hands that shook like they were palsied. There was swift relief from the unbearable pressure on his ankle, but it was immediately replaced by a sharp, piercing ache that swelled up and up and up into the unseen sky above. His ankle was grotesquely swollen, and touching it sent spasms of pain racing up his leg. Eddie carefully pulled himself up alongside the wall of the pit and performed an awkward crouch hop to the rear of the van. He peered out between the space between the floor of the garage and the back bumper, and immediately wished he hadn't. Arlie was sitting on the sparse lawn, basking in the mellow sun rays of a beautiful late summer's afternoon. This was Eddie's first clear look at him in the daylight, and he had to stifle a gasp of horror against the back of his hand. The Hewitt's son appeared to be the end result of a horrific genetic mutation. He was a monster. It was difficult to gauge his height, due to the fact that he was sitting, but Arlie looked to be in the neighborhood of 7 feet tall, and was almost as wide. He had a huge, bulging gut and shoulders like basketballs. The blood-splattered jogging suit he wore had to be custom-made. The leg of a XXL wouldn't even stretch around the ogre's enormous foot, let alone the tree trunk of a calf that it was attached to. Sweet Jesus, look at that thing. He must weigh 500 pounds at least. Probably more. Arlie's head was gigantic and misshapen, a Picasso nightmare topped by a circular tuft of sand-colored fluff. His eyes weren't level with each other. His nose was an underdeveloped nub of cartilage, and his brow was deeply shelved by Neanderthal ridges of bone. Arlie grinned vacantly up at the blue sky above, observing the passage of the clouds with simple-minded delight. His mouth was a crowded horror of random jostling fangs. He looked, to Eddie, to be a bizarre and nightmarish combination of human, hippopotamus, gargoyle, and goat. Debbie Hewitt lay face down in the duck grass and clover in front of him, the hand on her remaining arm clutching feebly for purchase in the sod. Even though she wasn't much more than a pile of blood-soaked rags at this point, Debbie was still trying to get away. Eddie didn't blame her. Arlie was pulling bits of flesh from her legs and popping them into his slobbering maw like they were popcorn chicken. As Eddie watched, his mouth turned down in disgust, Arlie pulled on a slippery tendon until it snapped, then tried to suck it up like a spaghetti noodle. A particularly amusing cloud caught his attention, and he giggled through clenched teeth. Debbie's husband still lay where Eddie had last seen him, flat on his back in the GMC, with his legs trailing out of the open side door. He was most certainly dead. Praise him, Eddie thought, and he shuddered. I'm gonna call the cops, freak, he murmured. Then you can eat some fucking hot lead. How's that? Eddie reached for his cell. It was gone. It wasn't in his hip pocket anymore. It wasn't in any of his fucking pockets. Eddie realized that he was crying. It was becoming extremely difficult not to give in to raw, hysterical panic. He dropped down onto his hands and knees and scoured the entire floor of the pit, taking great care not to bump his ankle or his poor, crooked pinky finger. All he found was a slot-headed screwdriver, a small pile of oily rags, and a dead Bic lighter. No phone. What am I going to do? He whispered. Tears dripped from the stubble on his cheeks and pattered like rain onto the concrete floor. He'd saved himself, sure, but now what? He was trapped like a rat in his goddamn pit. It was Saturday afternoon, and Eddie didn't have another job booked until Wednesday at 2 p.m. His nearest neighbor was a stone-deaf farmer that lived over a mile away. Between their properties, there was nothing but acres of thick bush and deep gullies. Eddie was a lifelong bachelor with no close family to become concerned by his absence. He did have friends and relatives, but days, even weeks often went by between phone calls and visits. He was a solitary man by nature, Eddie Paulson was. He could be missing for a long time before anyone even thought to check on him. He could die in this pit, and no one would know. Saturday, September 23rd, 8:10 p.m. Eddie was in too much pain to be hungry, but he was thirsty. Very thirsty, in fact. This was mildly ironic, because he also had to take a piss very, very badly. Arlie stopped treating his mother's mutilated legs like a buffet not long after she gasped her last breath and tremored her last tremor. This happened shortly before 6 o'clock, 5:59 p.m. to be exact. For some reason, Eddie had noted the time of her death on his watch. The lumbering monstrosity had let out a yawn, stretched and ambled off out of view, heading towards the house. Eddie had heard a crash as the giant kicked in his back door with one powerful thrust of his leg. Then, heard nothing more. Now there was only the gently gusting wind, stirring the leaves of the big maple tree in his front yard, and Paulson's own harsh, heavy breathing. Where is he? Is he in the house still? Where the fuck are you, you son of a bitch? I gotta go pee, Eddie croaked, and the stark simplicity of this statement made him want to cry again. He had to take a piss, but he couldn't. He wanted to drink a tall glass of water, but he couldn't. How the fuck did this happen? How the fuck? Eddie hadn't heard anything from Arlie in over 2 hours. His bladder was starting to scream. It was time to gather his courage and get the fuck out. The keys were in his truck. It was parked right beside the garage, no more than 20 feet from his current position in the pit. Even if he crawled there, Eddie could slide behind the wheel and be gone within minutes. He took one last look outside from the rear of the pit, then scuffle-hopped quickly to the front, already sweating in the face of what he was about to do. His hand stole into the big hip pocket on his coveralls and touched the screwdriver, seeking even a small amount of reassurance. Then slowly pushed his head through the narrow gap between the edge of the pit and the minivan's bumper. Eddie paused for a moment to listen, then braced his arms against the garage floor and heaved himself up. The bumper scraped against his lacerated back and ripped away the soft new scabs. Paulson growled a muffled curse from between clenched teeth and kept going. It was an extremely tight fit. How he'd ever managed to jump through that scant space in one go was a mystery. Christ almighty, his fucking phone! Somewhere out in the yard, his cell phone was ringing away like a funeral bell. Shut up, shut up, shut up! Eddie heard the creaky side door of his house blam open, and Artie bellowed, "Phone call!" He laughed, a high-pitched ree-hee-hee that raked jagged fingernails across Eddie's brain. "You got a phone call, mister." Fuck, 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 fuck. I'm stuck. And he was. Paulson, as skinny as he was, still managed to get stuck at the waist in the gap. The rough concrete edge bit into his stomach on one side, and the bumper pushed hard on his back on the other. The mechanic began to furiously wiggle back and forth, looking like a fish that's been stranded on a hard and rocky beach. Come on, goddammit. Fuck, shit, fuck. Outside, the phone abruptly stopped in mid-ring. Eddie redoubled his efforts and was rewarded with a sudden slide backward. The edge of the pit popped the tarnished snaps off of his coveralls as he slid, and they skittered away into the shadows. Oh, thank God. I thought I was stuck. Eddie stopped dead at his chest. The air squeezed from his lungs in a pained whoosh. He flailed his arms, and Arlie stomped into view from around the passenger side of the van. He was grinning, and his teeth were savage spears. The cell phone looked like a novelty miniature in his hand. Arlie smiled down at Eddie's terrified face and chirped, "You missed your phone call. You want to call him back?" Eddie opened his mouth to shriek, and Arlie swooped down, his goat eyes burning with maniacal glee. With surgical precision, he jabbed the edge of the cell phone into Eddie Paulson's front teeth, shattering them. They tumbled down his throat in fragments, and Eddie choked. Arlie whooped into light and hammered the hard plastic rectangle into his prey's unprotected skull, right dead center in the bloody knot that had already existed there. There was a brittle pop, and the phone shattered. Eddie saw a flash of darkness across his vision, and he knew that this was it. In the next few moments, he was going to die. "No, you motherfucker!" Paulson bellowed, and his words speckled the garage floor with red. "You leave me alone!" He heaved with the miracle strength of rampaging panic and dropped back into the pit. Agony exploded in his ankle, and Eddie screamed up at the minivan's rusty undercarriage with all of his might. He retched a thin stream of bile and curled into the fetal position. Arlie crouched and peered down at him with those bizarre square pupils, like a goat or a demon. The sun was setting, and the garage was now thickly cast in dark shadows, but Eddie could still clearly see Arlie's eyes. They were casting a dull, greenish-white glow in the gathering darkness. He can see in the dark, like a cat.
Arlie's gonna kill you, mister. He hates you. You're bad.
Arlie snapped his fearsome teeth together. The sound was hard and sharp in the silence.
Arlie will bite.
You have to stop this, Eddie wheezed. He hurt. Christ above, how he hurt. You're the one who's being bad, Arlie, not me. You have to stop this right now. In an instant, the mutant's enormous hand was clenching at the air just above Paulson's head. He flattened himself to the floor and squirmed away on his back, gritting his teeth against the pain.
Don't you say that. Arlie is good. Arlie is always good.
The monster's fury was terrifying. He roared at the ceiling and seized hold of the caravan's front end. With a scream of effort, he began to lift, and the front tires steadily rose until they were a heart-stopping 4 inches above the floor. Oh fuck. Holy fucking shit. Arlie's legs shook. He groaned, and he dropped the van with an angry grunt. It landed and rocked noisily on its suspension. Arlie hammered on the hood with his fist, and he gasped.
Arlie is always good. Don't you forget that, Dink.
The Hewitt's delightful baby boy began to pace around the garage, muttering darkly to himself and shoving things aside as he did so. Eddie waited to see what would happen next. His heart was in his throat. Arlie crouched down to peer into the pit, his eyes bright and full of murder. He tried to speak, but unable to find the words in his limited vocabulary that might adequately express his hatred, he growled like a dog instead. Stay away from me, Eddie whispered. Leave me alone and stay away. Arlie grinned.
No,
he said.
Not until you're dead, and there's nothing left but bones.
Please.
Nope.
Arlie grinned even wider. His eyes gleamed down at Eddie with a flat, murderous glow.
Not ever. Not until you're dead. Not until you're nothing but bones on the floor.